Question 34 of Prima Secunda is interesting in many ways. Only 4 articles, so it's kind of brief, but it's on the goodness and malice of pleasures. So, what St. Thomas Aquinas is tackling here is, can we put any kind of moral judgment on pleasures themselves? Are they all good? Are they all bad? Are some good, some bad? And historically, what have philosophers and theologians said about this? And so all of this is included in these 4 articles. And I think you're also going to find that a couple of things will probably surprise you about St. Thomas Aquinas' answers. And also, you'll see that Thomas has a very common sense, logical, and reasonable explanation of this without really going either way between the extremes on how you could answer these kind of questions. So Article 1 says whether every pleasure is evil. Okay, so you might have this natural, I wouldn't say natural, but this thought that, gosh, guilty pleasures, if I'm experiencing too much pleasure, maybe there's something wrong with that. Well, that's what he's getting at here. Are all the pleasures evil? And he says, some have maintained that all pleasure is evil. The reason seems to have been that they took account only of sensible and bodily pleasures which are more manifest. So right there, we're going to immediately see that St. Thomas Aquinas is not only talking about bodily pleasures. Okay, we think about, like this lady with her orange juice and her pastry or whatever that is, or, the pleasures of sex or drink or food or sleep. But he's saying, no, that's too narrow. We have to expand our idea of what pleasure is. That pleasure could be something intellectual as well, is what he's getting at. Since in other respects, the ancient philosophers did not discriminate between the intelligible and the sensible, nor between intellect and the sense. Okay, so they didn't make a distinction. He's talking mainly about the pre-Socratics, that they didn't, until late in the pre-Socratic age, did they realize that there's two things going on, intellect and sense, right? Of course, Plato very much got that, and so did Aristotle as well. And they held that all bodily pleasures should be reckoned as bad, and thus man, being prone to immoderate pleasures, arrives at the mean of virtue by abstaining from pleasure. Okay, so we all know that after original sin, we have a tendency, a concupiscence to overeat and oversleep and, just overdo it with bodily pleasures. And so therefore, some of the ancient philosophers have said, well, then they must be bad, like the Stoics, right? But they were wrong in holding this opinion, says St. Thomas Aquinas, because since none can live without some sensible and bodily pleasure, if they who teach that all pleasures are evil are found in the act of taking pleasure, men will be more inclined to pleasure by following the example of their works instead of listening to their doctrine or their words. Okay, so he's saying they're basically going to be hypocrites because it's impossible to not experience pleasure and also not to enjoy pleasure. And so if somebody's running around saying that they're all bad, well, that's not going to make much sense. We must therefore say that some pleasures are good and that some are evil. For pleasure is a repose of the appetitive power in some loved good, and resulting from some operation. Wherefore, we assign a twofold reason for this assertion. The first is in respect of the good in which a man reposes with pleasure. Okay, when we experience pleasure, we experience joy. We experience a good feeling, right? A degree, I guess, of happiness, you might say, right? For good and evil in the moral order depend on agreement or disagreement with reason, as stated above. Just as in the order of nature, a thing is said to be natural if it agrees with nature, and unnatural if it disagrees. Accordingly, just as in the natural order, there is a certain natural repose whereby a thing rests in that which agrees with its nature, for instance, when a heavy body rests down below, and again, an unnatural repose whereby a thing rests in that which disagrees with its nature, as when a heavy body rests up aloft. So in the moral order, there is a good pleasure, whereby the higher or lower appetite rests in that which is in accord with reason, and an evil pleasure, whereby the appetite rests in that which is discordant from reason and the law of God. So he's saying here, it all depends on whether the pleasure is in conformity with reason. And reason and nature have a very much of a correlation to them. The second reason can be found by considering the actions, some of which are good, some evil. Now, pleasures which are conjoined to actions are more akin to those actions than desires which precede them in point of time. Wherefore, since the desires of good actions are good, and of evil actions evil, much more are the pleasures of good actions good, and those of evil actions evil. Okay, so really, I think what to take away from this is that the actions have to conform to reason, and if they do, they're good, and if they don't, they're evil. Whether every pleasure is good. Okay, now he asks the opposite question. I think he's already kind of answered this, but Thomas doesn't like to leave any stone unturned. He said, while some of the Stoics maintain that all pleasures are evil, the Epicureans held that pleasure itself is good in itself, and that consequently all pleasures are good. They seem to have thus erred through not discriminating between that which is good simply and that which is good in respect of a particular individual. That which is good simply is good in itself. Now that which is not good in itself may be good in respect of some individual in two ways. In one way, because it is suitable to him by reason of a disposition in which he is now, which disposition, however, is not natural. Okay, now he gives an example. Thus, it is sometimes good for a leper to eat things that are poisonous, which are not suitably simple to the not suitable simply to the human temperament. All right, so under some circumstances, we have to do things that go against reason, like you have to take some kind of medicine, or you have to let's say even fasting for a long period of time kind of goes against nature, but there's a reason why you're doing it, so then that therefore it makes sense. In another way, through something unsuitable being esteemed suitable. And since pleasure is the repose of the appetite in some good, if the appetite reposes in that which is good simply, the pleasure will be pleasure simply and good simply. But if a man's appetite reposes in that which is good not simply, but in respect of that particular man, then his pleasure will not be pleasure simply, but a pleasure to him. Neither will it be good simply, but in a certain respect or an apparent good. So he's really trying to look at exceptions to the rule and look at every possible scenario where we can't have a black or white absolute definition of this. Article 3, whether any pleasure is the greatest good. Now, you might initially say, well, no, because, banana split and a nap and, whatever, these pleasures, they can't be the ultimate good. But remember, St. Thomas said that not all of the pleasures are physical. There are intellectual pleasures. That's where he's going to go with this. Plato held neither with the Stoics, who asserted that all pleasures are evil, nor with the Epicureans, who maintained that all pleasures are good. But he said that some are good and some are evil. Yet so that no pleasure be sovereign or reason or the greatest good. But judging from his arguments, he fails in 2 points. So Thomas is not going to agree with Plato. He's certainly not going to agree with the Stoics or the Epicureans, because Plato said that no pleasure can be the greatest good, right? He fails in 2 points. First, because from observing that sensible and bodily pleasures consist in a certain movement and becoming, as is evident in satiety, from eating and like, he concluded that all pleasures arise from some becoming and movement. And from this, since becoming and movement are the acts of something imperfect, it would follow that pleasure is not of the nature of ultimate perfection. But this is seen to be evidently false as regards intellectual pleasures, because one takes pleasure not only in the becoming of knowledge, for instance, when one learns or wonders, but also in the act of contemplation by making use of knowledge already acquired. So again, Thomas is making the distinction here between physical pleasures and intellectual pleasures, and he's going to make the case that the intellectual pleasure can be the greatest good. Secondly, because by greatest good he understood that which is the supreme good simply, that is, good as existing apart from and unparticipated by all else, in which sense God is the supreme good, whereas we are speaking of the greatest good in human beings. Now, the greatest good of everything is the last end, and the end is twofold, namely the thing itself and the use of that thing. Thus, the miser's end is either money or the possession of money. Accordingly, man's last end may be said to be either God, who is the supreme good, simply, or the enjoyment of God, which implies a certain pleasure in the last end. And in this sense, a certain pleasure of man may be said to be the greatest of all human goods. All right, you probably didn't think he was going to go there with this, but yes, the intellectual pleasure of beatitude, of heaven, is the greatest good. Whether pleasure is the measure or rule by which to judge of moral good or evil. Moral goodness or malice depends chiefly on the will, as stated above, and it is chiefly from the end that we discern whether the will is good or evil. You got to look at the end. Okay, what's the intention? What's the purpose, the end? Now, the end is taken to be that in which the will reposes, and the repose of the will and of every appetite in the good is pleasure. And therefore, man is reckoned to be good or bad chiefly according to the pleasure of the human will, since that man is good and virtuous who takes pleasure in the works of virtue, and that man evil who takes pleasure in evil works. On the other hand, pleasures of the sensitive appetite are not the rule of moral goodness and malice, since food is universally pleasurable to the sensitive appetite both of good and evil men, but the will of the good man takes pleasure in them in accordance with reason, to which the will of the evil man gives no heed. Okay, so that is the end of question 34 of the goodness of malice and malice of pleasures. Thanks for joining me. Hope you will join us tomorrow for question 35 of Prima Pars as we continue in this treatise on the passions. We still have about 14 or 15 more questions. God bless you. Thanks for watching.